Good afternoon to our viewers in Europe and good morning to our viewers in the United States. My name is Steve Sokol and I'm the president of the American Council on Germany. I'd like to welcome you to this edition of Double Exposure. The American Council on Germany and the Goethe Institute are partnering for this series of events that focus on what solidarity means in an environment of increasing polarization. Today's discussion will focus on cohesion and resilience in community and society and features two thought leaders on this issue. To introduce them, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Leonhard Emmerling, who will also moderate the discussion. Leonhard is the director of the Goethe Institute in Chicago and the man behind this series of events focusing on solidarity. Leonhard, it's been great to partner with you and with the Goethe Institute, and I very much look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's actually my pleasure working with you. It was a real delight organizing and holding these conversations. I would like to welcome today Dr. Leah Goes and Dr. Clara van den Berg for the conversation on society and community in what it does mean in respect to the idea of solidarity. I might briefly introduce our speakers. Dr. Leah Goes is Tupanchian, Chair in Civil Society and Social Change Postdoctoral Scholar for the 2023-2024 academic year at USC Dornsife at the University of Southern California. She completed her PhD in sociology at Harvard University in 2023. Her primary research interests center on the role of community organization as a vital aspect of the social safety net in how they shape access to resources for individuals, opportunities to build social networks, and promote civic engagement and respond to governmental policy and funding influences. Dr. Clara van den Berg is a researcher at the Center for Civil Society Research at the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin, which is roughly what is it, a Social Science Center Berlin, and Free University of Berlin. Her research focuses on civil society, democracy, and polarization. In November 24, she defended her PhD dissertation, which explored the long-term impacts of the 2015 pro-refugee community building and networks in Germany. Congratulations, Clara. Currently, she is part of the Einstein Stiftung Berlin project Coping with Effective Polarization, where she examines how civil society organizations navigate polarization in public discourse. Thank you very much for being with us today. You both focus in your work on empirical research. Instead of creating lofty theories about how a society should look like, how it should operate, you mainly look at what works and what doesn't, what is successful in creating social cohesion and what is not. When do people exercise solidarity? And when and why does solidarity lose its momentum? Leah, may I ask you, can you talk a bit about the work you did in Atlanta?
Hi, good morning. I just want to say thank you to the Goethe Institute and the American Council on Germany. For me, it's a dream, as I have taken German since 4th grade, and the Goethe Institute is a big part of my beginning journey with German. Today, I'm going to be providing some comments on these ideas of solidarity, social cohesion, community, and I'll be focusing in my analyses on research I've done in metropolitan Atlanta, which is a large city in Georgia. And I did research over 6 years there, 280 interviews with 96 organizations on the ground from 2018 to 2024. And I'll make some comparisons to research I've done with the Münchner Tafel, which is part of Tafel Deutschland. And I was there in the summer of 2019 to do some comparative work. So I'll provide some commentary on that. But I'm really excited for this conversation today. Let me just move this screen. on solidarity, social cohesion, and community, because I believe this is a conversation we really need to have, particularly in these very new, boggling, but slightly repetitive times of discontent and political confusion. And I want to start first with the argument that the solidarity we often talk about in regard to politics or intersectionality is an idea rooted in society. While social cohesion, the closeness and trust I may feel to my neighbors, is an idea rooted in community. Solidarity, sociologically, is less studied now than it was a century ago when Durkheim looked to it to understand trends in suicide, for example. We take the idea a bit for granted. We all know that solidarity is about connecting across some bigger, broader ideas, often an issue like women's rights or multiracial coalitions. But solidarity does, most often, play out when disparate groups vote as a bloc or raise concern together in protest. You can probably think of some of your own examples. But solidarity is not social cohesion. Social cohesion is a well-studied phenomenon regarding how people generally in close proximity trust one another and utilize those ties. We primarily do this with geographical boundaries, who lives nearby, or temporal ones, who's been around me the longest. The longer this proximity exists, the greater potential for social cohesion. I would argue that the most recent American election cycle occurred in a period where many voters could feel strong solidarity with like-minded individuals, but are simultaneously experiencing low social cohesion, feeling disconnected from their real-life neighbors. Loneliness is in fact at an all-time high. I think this is in part of what also explains much of the Democratic voter shock around how could my neighbors vote for Trump? Because they do not actually know who their neighbors are. I will also say that the internet and social media may be creating less social cohesion while fostering opportunities for cross-group solidarity. And someone, not me, should be doing more research on that. In sociological terms, when I say solidarity, I'm referring to how people can connect across social divides, big social divides. But beyond that, I think the bigger questions we are getting at here today is how can our societies weather social breakdown and distrust? Really, how can we build a resilient social fabric? Where can we connect efforts that foster solidarity and social cohesion, both in service to a stronger social fabric? And I present the idea that individuals can make sense of broader societal issues that can foster or inhibit solidarity in their everyday lives, able to perceive their fellow citizens as neighbors and their neighbors as part of this bigger social fabric. In this way, solidarity can happen at the community level through interaction, participation, and learning. You can learn to be in solidarity at the community level while simultaneously fostering social cohesion. So what am I talking about? The quick answer is we should all be volunteering more. How does this work? I'm currently writing a book about charitable food programs in the United States. And these organizations give out food to people free of charge or for a very small fee. It's very similar to Tafel Deutschland in Germany, though there are some programmatic differences and the participation numbers in the United States are about 8-fold larger. And in my book, I argue that our social fabric is made strong through both social cohesion and solidarity, and that charitable food programs like food pantries, where people can go and pick up this free food, often these organizations are run by volunteers, but those types of organizations help to strengthen our social fabric because they encourage social cohesion and solidarity through a process I call narrative weaving. Narrative weaving is an organizationally embedded process through which individuals can connect social ideas to community serving and community-oriented activities. For example, broad ideas around inequality, the haves and the have-nots, can be connected to how you might package Brussels sprouts or put carrots lovingly in a bag or talk to folks who visit the food pantry. All of a sudden, you become more aware of the social policies that shape who might be coming in the doors of those food pantries. It is not just the act of volunteering that helps me understand how federal policy shapes charitable food need, for example, but it's the conversations and the participatory engagement inclusive in this act. It is not merely the volunteering, it is the connection of understanding ideas that shape solidarity and shape my understanding of who's in the in-group or out-group that help create this process of narrative weaving. And how a food pantry expects you to treat aid seekers may change how you see people who are seeking aid and see them as an important part of both your community and your society. What I mean by this is that participating in charitable food programs can also alter how you vote, how you engage with your neighbors, and how you therefore build social cohesion and solidarity in community and society. You may vote for broader social policies that support poor families, and you may greet people with more patience and kindness at the bus stop, for example. Narrative weaving helps connect social cohesion and solidarity without sacrificing one for the other, because this concept connects the stories, schemas, and frames we use to understand our social world, from the broader society to the streets of our neighborhood. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Leah. I'm sure we'll come back to some details of your presentation and your talk, but maybe let me turn to Clara for the moment. Clara, in the last years, you followed the ebb and flow of solidarity, especially in Germany, after the so-called migration crisis in 2015. There was a massive surge in lived and practiced solidarity towards people who tried to seek asylum in Germany, triggered also by Angela Merkel's affirmation, "We can do it. Wir schaffen das." But over the course of time, solidarity faded away, if I'm not mistaken. Can you talk a bit about what happened and whether there's a certain pattern, these movements of searching solidarity, fading solidarity, whether there's a pattern these movements seem to follow?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for the invitation and the introduction. Thank you also, Leah, for this really fascinating input. I hope we can kind of connect these thoughts later. So my input is a little bit more, I guess, empirical. I'm going to talk about my empirical research, starting with the refugee reception crisis of 2015-16. Which you, of course, probably all remember when over, I think, 1 million people came to Germany in 2015-16 in that year alone. And we saw an incredible amount, an unparalleled amount of support. Lots of people, lots of volunteers who had never really worked in migration before, who had never really worked or had any contacts with refugees before, deciding to kind of welcome refugees at the train stations, going to the local refugee shelter to see what's needed. And this was kind of really unprecedented and I think a really interesting starting point to study solidarity. And I will talk a little bit about this time and then what kind of sparked solidarity, why it decreased, and also how solidarity can also help to establish long-term communities and help community building. So as I said, in 2015-16, many people helped. I think that around 1/3 of Germans supported refugees by making donations and other support, providing other support. 5 million people supported refugees on the ground providing German classes, providing childcare, everything you could think of as emergency support. Also food, clothing, etc. And then we know that 15,000 new projects and initiatives were created all across the country in that year alone, which was pretty surprising, I think, for everyone. And I already said that this refugee support had many phases. So you had people providing German classes. You also had, of course, people protesting on the streets and demonstrations, but most of the support was really provided within and around refugee shelters and family support centers and so on. So what sparked this wave of solidarity, which we haven't really seen in Germany after World War II. There was definitely first a humanitarian need, so there was a visible suffering of refugees. People could see refugees arriving in their cities' train stations. The media coverage was, of course, super high. But the mobilization was also driven by Christian values, people who, by humanitarian values, and there were a lot of middle-class people. So not your typical activists you could maybe find at demonstrations, but really the kind of ordinary people, as I said. And there was a spirit of optimism during that time. And I think Leonard already mentioned that Angela Merkel's statement, "Wir schaffen das, we can do it," really inspired a lot of confidence and action. So people, I think, wanted to be part of this hopeful project. And the more people kind of came and supported refugees, the more other people kind of felt inspired. And this was, really, really interesting. There was also a little bit of political activism, but the most part of this civic engagement was this this classic volunteering, what Leah already described. The political aspect definitely changed. So many volunteers and refugee support groups that were founded during that time developed a political motivation later when they were kind of, when they saw that refugees couldn't really get work permits, when the situation became much more difficult, also politically, then these types of groups also became more politically aware and started actions. But at first, it was this type of volunteering. But then, as Leonard also said, this solidarity and the activities around refugee support really declined in 2016-17. This is, first of all, very typical, and I think social movement research has a lot of examples for these waves of mobilization and demobilization. So this is a classic pattern of initial enthusiasm followed by a decline over months. I think this is very classic, and this is not only the case here, but you could also see other mobilizations. The Women's March movement in the US that kind of declined after a while, but also emergency support after Hurricane Katrina in the US, but also these types of disasters in Germany. But another reason was the shift from emergency support to integration. So there was a decline in refugee arrivals, and that also reduced the emergency needs. So there was less of an emergent need, less of an acute need. Of course, there was a huge need still for refugees to get support, but it was just not as visible. So the focus in this work shifted to long-term integration, and this is always much harder to sustain. I mean, to sustain movements, to sustain this type of action is always very, very difficult. And there were also overwhelming challenges that came that were very apparent in refugee support. So volunteers really struggled with the complex and long-term tasks of providing and taking care of refugees who had trauma from their experiences, who had many legal barriers. And so this resulted in burnout and frustration, not only on the side of the refugees, but also on the side of the volunteers who couldn't keep this work up. And many of them kind of returned to their normal lives and went to their back to their jobs. And a few, of course, stayed. And some of this is still going on today. And lastly, there was a changing public sentiment, as you know. I mean, there's a growing negative attitudes towards refugees in Germany. Now it's very, very apparent. But even in 2017, you could already notice that there was emergence of the right-wing actors, like a social movement actors, but also the Alternative for Germany, this right-wing party or far-right party, extremist party, that kind of started to influence the political landscape, which also, I think, reduced the solidarity in Germany. And then finally, I would like to mention, because I did a lot of research in 4 mid-sized cities in Germany. where I completed a lot of interviews and kind of followed the activities for a while. And I noticed that despite reduced mobilization and despite this kind of lasting, I am pro-refugee communities were formed in specific regions. And these pro-refugee communities, as I call them, I call them also local civic action communities, but they are similar to social movement communities. They are characterized by sustained interaction among volunteers and activists, but also associations, welfare organizations, church congregations, and so on. So in some cities, I found these communities that really survived over time. And my question was kind of, why? Why do some communities survive and some not? And there are different regions. But I really noticed that solidarity, first of all, in these types of instances, and this may be a different type of solidarity or a different, I take a different lens or perspective than Leah. Solidarity is born out of immediate crisis here in this case, and can evolve under certain conditions into long-term community structures and maybe long-term solidarity. But this like a wave or spark of solidarity is here born of immediate crisis, or I guess it doesn't have to be a crisis, but a need or something that is can spark this solidarity. And then community building, as I studied it, can kind of develop out of this solidarity through shared experiences. And so it can be developed through collective experiences and mutual support. It can be developed through facing and overcoming adversities together, which I think tightened these communities that I observed, and then continuous collaboration, continuous interaction, and an emotional connection is super important to kind of keep this community building up, or you could also say this solidarity up. Yeah. Thank you so much. This is it from me for now.
Thank you very much, Clara. This is very fascinating, and there are a lot of questions I have about this, but you both mentioned the relevance of volunteering, and I would love to come back to that. But may I ask Leah first about something I found in her thoughts about the question of solidarity. You mentioned that you speak about solidarity on a micro and on a macro level. And it's, if I understand you correctly, you connect social cohesion to community level and solidarity to society level. Can you revisit that idea a little bit and elaborate on that? Thank you.
So happily to do so. I think of it I love a diagram. This idea that at the society level, we have this broader way of understanding and really seeing where solidarity plays out over time. So I think when I think about what Clara has shared, solidarity in this way is something you can see over many decades, over many years, to this bigger coalition base, perhaps over time. We can think about examples that would be really good around solidarity are how like Democrats and Republicans in the Senate always vote on farm bills, or how people in community in the United States may, there's these interracial coalitions, right? Black and Hispanic Latinx voters voting in conjunction on certain issues, though of course this past election has presented some faltering in that. And that at the community level, which is, underneath society, that's where social cohesion plays out. And I separate those because I spent 6 years in almost 100 organizations in Metro Atlanta, talking to people who were engaged in work of feeding their neighbors. In the United States, 1 in 9 to 1 in 11 people are food insecure. And these organizations, of which there are almost 60,000 across the United States, serve about 1 in 6 people in the US. 1 in 6 people go to a charitable food organization like a food pantry every year. Probably closer to 1 in 7 when there's not a financial crisis or a pandemic. And in Germany, in Tafel Deutschland, there's only 1,000 Tafels. There's only 1,000 of them. So in comparison to the size of these organizations and their reach, the reason why I mention this like the size and the reach of these organizations is because at the community level, when we talk about social cohesion, it became clear that these places, these food pantries, these soup kitchens really were places where people got to know their neighbors. At the same time, they were places where people were beginning to understand ideas that were bigger than just the food pantry, just their proximate neighbors. All of a sudden, they were making sense of poverty policy, of food policy, why it mattered that their bus stops didn't have any overhangs for shade. And then they all of a sudden were organizing in their city to put shade covers over their bus stops so people who came to their food pantry would be shaded. And in my mind, I see that as a movement from social cohesion to being in solidarity, because those efforts play out at a broader societal level. They impact people beyond the community because the laws change. I bring this all into this comparison because I think so much of when we think about volunteerism only happens at this community level. But my hope is that we understand that volunteering creates these participatory engagements. We can see how solidarity can actually be taught at the community level and how that engagement can actually shift patterns in solidarity and how people are functioning. That's that micro level engagement of solidarity. That's how it gets woven in at the community level.
And this is also what you refer to with narrative weaving, that it's that these community micro level social cohesion practices kind of build up to solidarity on the macro level, which is then society. Do I understand that?
And it happens for individuals. So this is an individual level phenomenon in the sense that it's a process I can experience. So for example, I went with my mother to a food pantry where I grew up in Atlanta, and my mother didn't know that in the United States, what we have is called SNAP, food stamps. We give people monetary assistance to buy food in a grocery store. But about 1/3 of people who say they are food insecure, who are hungry, do not qualify because they are not poor enough. That's like 13 million people. And so when we were at the food pantry, my mother learned this fact. This is something that became aware to her. She was engaging with people who were coming in and with the other volunteers. And as we go home, my mother comments to me, how is it that there are people who are hungry who can't get that help? That's wrong. And I was like, well, will that change how you vote? And she's like, it will certainly make it clear to me that if someone doesn't put that on their platform, I don't want to vote for them. And so it's this idea that individual engagement and narrative weaving, all of a sudden she's putting together this story in her volunteer work to understand broader policy. That's at the individual level. And then if you see this happen over time, as I did in organizations, you can see whole food pantries change their entire functioning to better work on equity. So helping people who come in volunteer, sharing in civic engagement. So then it can play out at a broader community level as well. So you can see this phenomenon for individuals and for whole communities, whether that's geographical or a demographic-based understanding of community.
It's a beautiful and very positive picture you're drawing here, and it's fantastic. But may I come back to Clara then, because you describe a build-up of a movement, while Clara somehow described the kind of being tired or getting tired of that movement. And that would be my question about where you both speak about volunteering, and so my question would then come in to both of you, but maybe Clara first. I mean, volunteers get tired at some point. They can't do it all the time because they have a normal life. They have a life to live. They have to earn some money. They have their jobs and things like that. So my question would be, Leah, while you paint a positive picture, Clara paints more a kind of not sad but a different picture. So what do you think about the idea that that volunteering then needs to lead to institutions where that idea that is apparently alive within lots of people, and then lots of people feel empathy and towards their next kin or towards their neighbor and towards the ones who are in need. But doesn't that need to be built into institutions so that can be sustained beyond the engagement of the individuals? Maybe Clara, first. What do you think?
Yeah, if you mean, do you mean institutions like having getting paid for volunteering, or maybe make it part of? I mean, I think there are talks. They have been ideas, I guess, and not policies, but ideas in Germany to create time away from the job that is still like maybe 5 hours a month where you get still paid and you can do volunteering or something like this. I don't know if you think about institutions like this, but for sure volunteering in the long term is very difficult. I think there are also phases in life. I think we see that people around 30, 40 who start families, who have kids, jobs, tend to volunteer, at least in Germany, a little bit less. And then when people get older, they have time again, they are in retirement, and then they kind of increase, volunteering increases in that generation. But I think that there are certainly ways to kind of make it easier for people to spend time volunteering if they want to, because many people actually do. I think there's definitely a shift from volunteering in these traditional volunteering in these associations, these type of Vereine in German, associations where you have a clear membership and you pay your little fee every year, and you have your a yearly meeting, and then you have a president, everything. This is very traditional volunteering, and I think we see less of this. So people are less interested in being involved in these kind of in these structures, but more and more people want to be involved in projects. They want to be more flexible. Maybe they want to volunteer for 6 months, a year, and then they want to kind of change a project, do something else, maybe stop volunteering and then get on. And I think we organizations and civil society, also the established organizations, have to kind of find ways to make that possible, because they many of these organizations are still hoping that once they have a volunteer, they can just it's safe, they will come, they will do their job. But this is just, I think, a very different time from 20, 30 years ago, where that kind of connection, maybe also this identity, or this people identifying with an association, is just, I think, less clear.
Yeah, no, I really like that question. And when Clara was talking, I wrote down infrastructure because I think it's a part of this story. How can Clara and I have these different understandings of what volunteerism kind of ends up in, like down the road 2 years? And I think that the story for us is different because Clara is talking about a phenomenon that took place over the course of 3 years. And I was in food pantries that were founded in 1975 and still exist, which one asks, begs the question of like, well, what problem are they solving if they still exist 50 years later? And I think the difference in this question is food pantries and charitable food in the United States is a major part of our social safety net infrastructure, because many of them are nonprofits who receive tax benefits for existing. And we pump billions of federal dollars into these food pantries through the purchase of food through federal programs. So they're very well established. And they, even in the sense of crisis, so if we look to the pandemic, when food need skyrocketed across the US, it wasn't new organizations that were forming to meet this need. It was existing organizations expanding their reach. So for example, let's say a church has a food pantry. And in the US, we don't have like Kirchensteuer, so people don't pay a tax to belong to a church. They would pay like their tithes to the church however they want, if they want to. A church has a food pantry, which in the US is very legal and in nonprofit law. They can put out federally funded food. It's all good and easy to do. So instead of saying multiple churches in the community started their own pantries during the pandemic, these churches already had the infrastructure. And all they did was open one more day a week or put out, twice as much food when they were open. And that's another piece of this. I'm really curious, Clara, if you found this. With food pantries and charitable food in the US, these organizations aren't open all the time. So it's not like a 9 to 5. It's not like people are giving up their jobs. They might volunteer for 3 hours on a Thursday night because that's the only time they're open. And many food pantries in my sample actually operated on what someone referred to as retirement hours. So this idea that because so many volunteers are retired, that they only operate between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. because it's the least amount of traffic for people on the road, right? So it's not as intensive, and the need, while it's acute for some people who are experiencing it, the hunger needs in the US are chronic. We've never had less than 9% of food insecurity ever. So people are always going to be in need of food. I remember actually when I was at the Münchner Tafel, someone was mentioning this importance of volunteering. He was talking about being in Ruhestand, being retired. He's like, I'm not standing quietly. Like this, I'm retired, but I'm engaged. And I think that's part of this story is like, you've got people who want to be involved, but it's not all the time. It's once a week. I think it really matters to this sense of crisis, to what Clara is talking about. I'd be curious to know more. This crisis piece, I think, plays a huge role in burnout and lasting infrastructure questions.
Maybe I can just contribute a few more thoughts because I think it's super interesting. I just wanted to say that, of course, I've looked at this decrease and decline of volunteering, but I also found these great communities that kind of stayed alive, and that organizations and also these volunteer groups kind of survived and remained super active. And I think one contributing factor for sure was the friendships, the interactions, everything that a volunteer could get out of their activities. That's not monetary, of course, but the emotional connections, the being part of this group, and they are excited to see each other at events, at film screenings. They do summer parties. These types of personal connections are super important to keep volunteering up, because burnout is just is just very typical for these types of activities. I think many people, as I think Leah said at the beginning, can create social cohesion at the local level, and then they know each other, and then they want to kind of keep meeting one another. But this is, I think, easier in projects and initiatives where people can really engage and not get a specific job and but be engaged and kind of can also decide things and be a very active contributor, instead of standing somewhere and building something once a month and then it's done. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but being like really this type of engagement and interaction is very, very important.
Yeah, like it's not transactional. Like that participation and interpersonal engagement is key. Because if it's just about a service or a resource, I don't think those relationships form.
May I just interject here a question from the chat, because we're talking about volunteering, and there's a pertinent question: what role does volunteer work play in the German healthcare system? The question to Clara, and then I would love to come back briefly to the question of institution. Maybe Clara, you want to respond?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think if you think of healthcare in a broader sense, not only in the hospital, but providing care in hospices and other types of medical care centers and so on. I think there are a lot of volunteers in this sector, this healthcare sector. There are a lot of volunteers. I think there are many institutions and many nonprofits are really dependent on volunteers. And I remember before, I think, was it like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we had this, you probably also know this military service, or you could also choose this volunteer year. I also did this volunteer year, even though I didn't have to do it, but many men especially chose this volunteer year to get out of the military service. And after that stopped, this kind of mandatory service, a lot of medical and a lot of clinics and so on were really had a really difficult time to provide the care they had provided before, because all these people, these young people who supported the clinics were missing. So this was kind of difficult. So that kind of goes to show how important volunteering is in this sector.
Thank you very much, Clara, for that clarification. Maybe I come back briefly to that question of institutions. Maybe I'm obsessed with that question, but maybe it's still interesting. I mean, institution, I mean more like, okay, that there would be tax incentives to companies to, I mean, going back to the refugee crisis, to employ refugees, or even you can say companies have to have a quota that they have to employ refugees to a certain percentage, like we have it with Germany has it sometimes with disabled people, or they have a quota on how many women have to be on board of a company, and so that there is a legal infrastructure, or it's legally institutional, juridically institutionalized to exercise that solidarity beyond the scope of empathy or beyond my community. This is what I meant with institution, and I'm pretty sure it's seen at this side of the Atlantic differently than it's seen on this side of the Atlantic. So maybe who wants to go first? Leah?
Okay. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that since we had engaged in having this talk, because in the US, I mean, when we think about some of the political context, or if we look at how the Ampelkoalition, like Germany's got its own thing going on right now.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But in the US, we have this election pointed out, one, which we've already known, this major social divide about who votes Democratic, who votes Republican. And then all of a sudden this election happens and people are voting in ways no one thought. And it's this idea that we don't know each other. And I think that conversation is actually kind of overriding, or rather it's much louder than some of the conversations we should have on like what solidarity really looks like in the US. And I think when we talk about this institutionalized bit, it's hard for solidarity to be institutionalized in the US the way we might see it in Germany, because we don't have coalitions. We have a two-party system. So when we talk about solidarity playing out in our institutions, it's more like, I can think of some of the examples in the comments, like when organizations form, when you've got hospitals working with nonprofits, working with schools, where communities, counties or a large area that covers millions of people are starting to provide services or act in a way that is promoting some type of community supportive ideal. Because when we talk about solidarity at the truly federal level, it just doesn't work the same way, because we're not going to have three parties that come together, because we don't have three parties that could come together. That's just not how our system works. But solidarity can happen in the way some groups vote on certain down ballot, say for instance, like initiatives around housing or houselessness, initiatives on clean water, emissions, that kind of thing. It's, I think, the biggest difference too between Germany and the US when it comes to how we can understand and experience solidarity is back to this idea about what volunteerism can look like. And I think simply that volunteerism is an older and more institutionalized concept in the US than in Germany, solely because, I mean, we can look to de Tocqueville, who came to the US in the 1800s just because he was like, what's going on here? Everyone's involved, everyone's engaged. And today we have entire systems in our federal and state governments dedicated to supporting those organizations in ways that just don't really exist in Germany. I think the perfect example actually is comparing our charitable food to like Tafel Deutschland. Tafel Deutschland receives absolutely no government funding. And in the US, food pantries, soup kitchens, those types of organizations, it's estimated receive around like $50 billion worth of support, whether that's monetary or in the value of food. So they're just very different institutional spaces for sure.
Yes, definitely. I mean, in Germany, they don't get state funding, but then people get kind of a social security, and they hopefully, obviously not all can buy groceries. They can't, not because, I mean, we have these tafels, and they are definitely needed. So there's definitely kind of a need that's not met by the state for sure. When I think about these institutions and tax incentives, I think, so first of all, a lot of companies were excited in Germany. I don't know how many, I don't know the numbers, but I remember I also interviewed a couple of companies and businesses, and they were excited and ready to get refugees and integrate them into their companies, and also there's a competitiveness. A lot of companies need workers, skilled workers, unskilled workers, I think I'm sure there was also a solidarity, but there's also, I mean, these companies need workers, and there's a shortage of workers. And I think this is kind of the main reason. And I think tax incentives could have been realized, I think, in 2015, when the situation and the sentiment was towards refugees was different. But I think today we're such in a different time regarding immigration. And I think, I mean, the companies are pretty open to migration, but since many people, voters, are kind of increasingly anti-migration, it's very, very difficult. And this tax incentives, I don't think would be would be realistic at the moment. But in terms of, I mean, because you asked before, Leonard, you asked when we talked before, you thought about this kind of, could we also see a mandatory volunteer year or something like mandatory volunteering in Germany? And I think this is also a little bit difficult to reintroduce after it's kind of gone. It's very difficult to reintroduce. Even it's also very difficult to introduce this military service again, this military service. I think many people, I don't know, I don't think there's this type of vast solidarity at the macro level where kind of you would find a majority for this mandatory volunteer year. And I'm not even sure this is kind of useful anymore. I think it's much more useful to support local civil society organizations, small initiatives, give them funding, give them space where they can meet. I mean, we have a lot of funding cuts at the civil society level at the moment in Germany. I think there will be kind of we will see them in 2025, and we'll see the consequences. But I think it's much more useful to give money to organizations to kind of keep their work up instead of kind of supporting this mandatory volunteer year. I also don't think it's the time for it. I don't think we have that level of social cohesion at the macro level that people would be very fond of it. That's just my guess. Yeah.
Thank you very much to both of you. We have roughly 10 minutes left. And maybe we started with your experience on the ground, you, Leah, working with food pantries, and you, Clara, looking at the support of for migrants, that search of solidarity with foreigners or with strangers. And so maybe if I'm allowed, then I may move to another question, which is a little bit more theoretical, but it's actually kind of comes from a reading I did. It's a book by Leah Hunt Hendricks and Astra Taylor, Solidarity: The Past, Present, Future of a World-Changing Idea. And I was totally surprised that they argue against charity organizations in the US for several reasons. And their argument actually is at the end, the argument that charity and the kind of the exercise of solidarity via charity cements inequality. Well, I mean, we probably will never get rid of inequity but they also read charity and innovate solidarity via charity as a tool to maintain inequality in a society. And I find that I was kind of puzzled by it, and I wonder what you think about the relationship between solidarity and equality in a society. Would solidarity maybe not the basis of equality of a society, but maybe solidarity would be a tool to achieve equality in society? That makes, Leah, you nod. Maybe you go first.
I teach a class on non-governmental organizations and social change, and this question of is charity bad comes up for about 2-3 weeks, where my students just are boggled by the idea of like, are the systems that we have in place actually continuing to exacerbate the problems? And I think the way you're phrasing this question, Nanad, is like, in a way, the problem I think that's at hand is if we can have solidarity in an unequal world, because solidarity is just when two groups have joined to, or however many groups have come together on an issue, or, we can more broadly think of it that, they've come together in the government or patriotism, but we could pick a smaller issue, like say, for instance, we care about safe parks. That's still an act of solidarity. And so solidarity can exist in a place and in a society where things and people are unequal, where we have major class differences, major race differences, and those turn out with like disparate results for health or life expectancy, however you measure it. So for me, when we talk about the role of charity, I don't actually really think that every organization should be viewed as being a charity organization as like, oh, us with the haves are giving to the have-nots. I think of it more as like a way to differentiate between things that are given away free of cost or are like nonprofits. So rather their tax structure. I think having nonprofit organizations is very useful to allow communities to establish organizations that anyone can join. But in this space, the biggest thing for me when we think about what solidarity can be and the goals to reduce inequality is centering dignity. Because we live in an unequal world now, getting rid of like nonprofits and charity, I think I actually can't imagine that. I would love someone to explain to me what it would look like if we just, with the snap of our fingers, got rid of every nonprofit in the US. But the thing is I think how we make charitable organizations, nonprofit organizations really serve the betterment of society isn't by getting rid of them, it's by centering dignity in what they do. And by this, I mean making it so people who have less voice, who have, you know, a reduced ability to have an opinion, have less money to donate, still are equitably a part of the decision-making process. And I think this is why I'm so optimistic about charitable food orgs, about food pantries, is because I saw this happening. I saw food pantries that their aid seekers were the volunteers. Everyone was involved in the giving back process. And that made things very different in those spaces because people felt like they were not just takers, but they were givers and creators, and they were true neighbors in that it was the give and take. And so I'm optimistic because I've seen it. I don't think it's going to work everywhere, but these questions we have around, can we make our society more just or better, I think really have to first be like, how are we centering dignity and who's at the, you know, in the conversation? Because even if we bring those people in conversation, there's still massive need. So we still have to meet it. You know, it's like the chicken egg cycle. So my thought is, let's bring dignity front and center and then see where we are in a decade. Because, you know, bureaucracy moves slowly. So here we are.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating question. I've also been thinking about this a lot. I think there is solidarity at the state level, at least from this is, I mean, a very German perspective, but I think there needs to be this type of solidarity at the state level where the state, everyone pays taxes, everyone pays, I mean, some pay more, some pay less, but everyone pays taxes, and there's to provide to kind of fund a social system where everyone can live in dignity, which is I don't think is the case in Germany anymore. I think many people live underneath the poverty line, so it clearly doesn't work. But it's still very, very important to keep the system up, I think. And I think, but part of this, or in addition to the state, I think there is also another solidarity that comes from civil society, from everyone who can contribute. And then I completely agree with Leah that there needs to be solidarity at this local level where people feel a common humanity and feel connected to each other. And there's strikes, there's unionization, there's solidarity with migrants. Also, there's solidarity with the in-group kind of, or with workers. You can kind of create this commonality. You can create, but you can, as my example also shows, create solidarity with people that are actually at the out-group, I guess, or are not part of my inner circle, and are very different to me. And there, I guess this is a type of maybe the dignity or the humanity, and this type of we are humans, and we have basic needs, and these people are in danger and they are in need, and so we can kind of provide. But this is, I think, the more difficult, I guess, solidarity to sustain maybe. Because it's, the volunteers who support refugees still, and I looked at this time frame from like 2015 to 2020, 2021, the politics changed, and neighbors are critical of volunteers, and they get a lot of criticism. Why are you still working? Why are you still supporting these people? They should manage on their own now, and so on. So it's much more difficult to navigate, but I think there are still many people who are on it, and there I think institutions in terms of the state kind of supporting civil society with money and with resources is just very important to keep these organizations and initiatives up and for the long term, because yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. I think that was a beautiful iteration of double exposure. And thank you very much, Clara. Thank you very much, Leah. I thought it was really interesting and a lot of food for thoughts. Thanks also to Steve and Emma from the American Council on Germany. The podcast will be up, I guess, on our websites in a few days. And there will be one last iteration of double exposure with Leora Ausländer and Miriam Wenzel from the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt. Leora Ausländer is a scholar here from the University of Chicago. Thank you again, and talk soon. Thank you. Bye.